Well, hi, everybody. This is Jonathan Miller, and welcome to the What It Means podcast, where I try to figure out the hows and whys of the housing market. For those of you that don't know me, I am the co-founder of Miller Samuel Real Estate Appraisers, which is a New York-based appraisal firm that I co-founded and run since 1986, so that's a long time. I'm also the author of the Douglas Elliman report series. I've been doing that for about 31 years. Elliman's footprint over the U.S. I cover many of those markets in my with housing market research. I'm also a professor of market analysis at Columbia University, which I've been doing since 2018. And I'm the author of Housing Notes, which I've been the author for about 11 years. It's a 1 to 3 time weekly. It actually is 3 times weekly, but it started out as 1 time weekly for the last 11 years on issues that face you in the housing market. It's easy to sign up. It's at housingnotes.com, and I cover many of the issues in detail that we talk about here and what your customers and clients, if you're a real estate agent, are thinking about at the moment. The first thing I wanted to touch base on today was something that is near and dear to my heart. It's the appraisal. There's a sort of a appraisal scandal that was came out yesterday, and I'm sorry, came out Thursday, but it's in the hard print or the print section of the New York Times today. I think it's on page A20. It's a full page. And it's basically what I've been writing about in Housing Notes for the last 11 years. Or, actually, I really started writing about this 8 years ago and sort of shook things up in the appraisal profession to the point where I've been personally threatened and smeared for the stuff that I've been writing about over these years. And it's very satisfying to see it being brought to light now. Um, if you're in the real estate business and you're selling property or representing a seller or a buyer, you run into appraisers as a matter of course. And I, of course, am a real estate appraiser. I can say that I've appraised over 8,000 properties in my career, and I'm still doing so, perhaps less than I was when I was younger. But I bring this up because many of you meet appraisers on site. And the industry has one of the largest trade groups is called the Appraisal Institute. And I've been essentially savaging them in commentary over the last 8 years. And the reason is because they have essentially abandoned the residential appraiser, not really representing them, not acting in their best interests. And now they have a Me Too scandal and also a testing scandal. The way this relates to you is that if we go back prior to the pandemic, just as the pandemic was breaking out, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were their regulator is known as FHFA, and they essentially opted, with appraisers' blessing during the sort of dark days of the pandemic, to not force appraisers to meet individuals inside the property because it was dangerous. And we assumed that they were going to sort of adjust lending risk based on this because, if I didn't go in a house, I couldn't see 500 feral cats that were living there. You sort of get my point that it is one step removed from in terms of credibility for the value. The but the takeaway has been that uh, essentially appraisers now are being used much less on a national level. In fact, towards the end of the sort of pandemic era, about 60% of mortgages didn't have an appraisal. They had a Zestimate, or what we call, they didn't Zestimate is a brand name and it's really on the consumer side, but there's about a dozen AVMs, or automated valuation models, that are available across the country. And they're also as wildly inaccurate. And they don't see the inside of the property. I think I've mentioned this on a prior podcast, but let me just give you a 50-cent overview to remind you of how wildly inaccurate his estimate is. His estimate is essentially the lender presses a button and there is a valuation made for based on a property address. The problem with this is that the value in his estimate, the median accuracy rate is about 2% nationally. So that means that when the property sells, the estimate is within, the median accuracy is within 2%. So that sounds okay to me, except for the fact that it's the median, in air quotes, the median accuracy rate, which means that half the time the number is within 2%, and half the time it's not. So the half the time it's not could be off by 100%, 200%, 300%. It's essentially garbage. And if you look at it that way, you have to remember that that's only if the property is listed. So if the property is listed for sale, it's within, the median accuracy rate was within 2% half the time. If it's not listed for sale, the median accuracy rate is within 7% half the time, which means that 50% of the time it's within 7%, and 50% of the time it's not. So it's essentially garbage. And without going into too much nitty gritty on the Appraisal Institute scandal, which I'll cover in a second, but just because it's germane to the real estate profession, is that this is exactly what Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, the regulator FHFA is looking for, is a way for them to stop using individuals, appraisals, and just go automated. The problem with that is they're wildly inaccurate, as I just illustrated with this estimate average description. And on top of it, if you're selling a home that's beautifully renovated, this estimate doesn't know that. And it works against your sellers. It's basically super dumb. But because of the scandal with the Appraisal Institute, it just helps Fannie, Freddie, FHFA to sort of continue going down this path, which they're already starting. The scandal is that leadership at the Appraisal Institute, which is the appraisal industry's largest trade group. I mean, it's sort of the equivalent of NAR for brokerages, except for realtors are about 99% larger as an organization. We're talking millions. The Appraisal Institute, we're talking, they claim 16,000. It's probably much less than that if you don't count dead people or people that don't, haven't been a member for years. I bring this up because on top of all this, Me Too scandal, which is the New York Times has a great article on this, and I wrote about this last Thursday in detail on Housing Notes. But Oh, and I should say, I always forget to mention this. If you have any comments or questions during this presentation, you can comment on the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen, and I will see it and I will try to answer your questions. The other issue with appraising is testing. So there's fraud in testing. In other words, appraisers have to take classes just like brokers to get continuing education credit. And the answers to some of the questions were wrong. So appraisers that were answering putting the right answer, uh, were marked wrong, and they may have failed their continuing ed or their, attempt to become a certified appraiser. And then people that are that answered it wrong, but because of the error in the way they grade these things, they got credit for it and passed, and now they're certified appraisers. You can imagine, the ramifications of this. And then on top of it, they've covered it up for years. And in fact, the most recent CEO of the Appraisal Institute was fired because she wanted to come clean and tell the story about this. And now she's suing the Appraisal Institute. So it's just a mess. And frankly, the organization needs to be removed and something take its place. It's the perfect comp for what's happening with the National Association of Realtors. They're no longer relevant. Their membership, I think, over the next few years is probably going to collapse because membership by most of the big brokerage firms is not mandated anymore. I'm not saying everything NAR does is not useful, but I'm just saying that they're nowhere near what they were. And there's other organizations already being created, like the American Association of Real Estate um, Agents. I think that's what it's called, is one example of it. And we'll probably see something in the appraisal world. It's just a bizarre, sort of interesting thing, that real estate associations, trade groups are going through almost simultaneously, um, as real estate, sort of suffers through this downturn. Anyway, that's probably enough of that. But I do want you to understand when you have a real estate appraiser coming to a property, and and you're meeting them, just at some point in the future, you may not have that anymore. I'm not trying to be alarmist or exaggerate, but at least on the banking side, there is a movement to automate, and the automation is going to be far worse uh, to the real estate agents because of the inconsistency and the lack of understanding of what is actually inside of a property. And think of the trillions in the bond market that mortgages are based on, and now they could be based on something does not involve a human being, which is a little concerning for not just real estate, but for the housing market and the general economy. Anyway, that's enough fear mongering for the moment. The other thing that you should think about, and this is something that I've talked about quite a bit, is the whole tariff situation. We just had a big announcement today that China and the US have come to some sort of tariff agreement. It's not entirely clear how this is going to play out, but there seems to be some sort of ending coming gradually. If you remember that the US had placed 145% tariffs on goods being imported into the US, and as you can see, or have seen in the news that there's been a collapse in inbound traffic from China, in terms of trade, items of trade, in the ports like in Seattle and Los Angeles, and recognize stores like Walmart. About 80% of the stuff on the shelves is coming from China. So if you can imagine it being 2 to 3 times more expensive there, um, there would be a significant increase in layoffs, and the odds of a recession have been rising significantly. They're still holding at about 60% as a chance of recession. And what does that mean to you? It means more unemployment, a lot more unemployment, and so fewer people that are going to be in the housing market. And it also means less affordability. Tariffs are inflationary. That is a fact. And we're already seeing upward, even without everything sort of going full on tariff mode. We are seeing pressure on rates. And in fact, um, on Thursday, I think it's at noon, when every week Freddie Mac releases their mortgage rates. Last week, or the last few weeks since the sort of tariff tantrum began in last month, that you are seeing mortgage rates sort of stuck at elevated levels. Whereas, there have been cries for the GSE, or not GSEs, the Federal Reserve, to cut rates. If the tariff situation goes away, the odds of a recession will probably reduce a bit, and we'll probably see interest rates probably fall or slide a bit. It's all very weird right now. Essentially, what the two countries have agreed to is that the American consumer will pay 30% more for Chinese goods, and the Chinese consumer will pay 10% more for Chinese goods. Um, and that's temporary. That's another 90-day delay. So we see this sort of chaos not ending, but perhaps somehow coming to a painful close, which I think overall is good for the housing market long term. The problem is, and New York aside, because New York is booming, we are seeing um, heavy new signed contract activity, as we reported last week, in New York, and that's relatively, the way to think of it is relative the exception nationwide. Nationwide, we're seeing um, uh, essentially sales weaken, sort of struggling to move sideways. New signed contracts are up a little bit last month, but year over year they're down. Things are, I don't want to be overly negative. I'm trying to maintain a balanced sort of outlook on this, but nothing about the tariffs is good for the country. Tariffs are fine in specific applications, but not wholesale across the economy, and that's what I've been pointing out in housing notes, and here quite a few times, because they're inflationary, and the last thing we want right now are higher interest rates. So it does provide some seeds of optimism that we may see um, less sort of less about the tariffs, because this is sort of an opening for the current administration to sort of get out of this situation that they've sort of painted themselves into a corner with, perhaps with good intentions, but clearly not understanding how tariffs work in the economy. Um, I bring this up because I've been thinking a lot, we're now firmly sort of embedded in the spring market. And New York, I think the spring market is going to be a typical spring market, and we're sort of already seeing that with contracts are up and probably going to continue to be strong into the summer. But in the U.S., there's a lot more doubt about that in other markets that we cover, like we're seeing weakness in Florida in terms of contracts. Nothing dramatic, but we definitely are seeing markets weaken, and some markets are weakening more than others. Um, I have to sort of rant for a second. Whenever you're reading about the performance of a housing market and you look at what they're covering, there was a Bloomberg story a couple of days ago. It was late last week. It might have been Friday. That sales closing data from the state of Florida is down, and it's down a bunch across the state. And yeah, I'm sure most of you realize that housing markets are local. And I've been long talking about the weakness of the Gulf side with more inventory growth than the ocean side. Not saying that the ocean side isn't seeing more supply, but they're very different markets, and the Panhandle is very different, and so it's really inappropriate to think about inventory or market performance on a statewide basis. For those of you that are watching this that are in New York, think about Manhattan and Syracuse, upstate New York. Is it really helpful to blend all that together to come up with, sales are up in New York State or down in New York State? Does that make any sense at all? It makes no sense. It's just numbers, and it's presented in a sort of misleading way, not intentionally. It's more defined on what data you have, as opposed to, what represents accuracy, or, giving the listener or reader a state of what's going on. I think, what we're seeing nationwide is we're seeing more inventory come in. We're seeing housing price growth be tempered. We're seeing housing prices decline in the Sun Belt states, which is where there's a lot more inventory growth. And we're seeing housing prices continue to rise in outside of the Sun Belt state, where inventory is still, while it's rising, it's still wildly inadequate for demand, even with rates being stuck at a higher level, just below 7%. Anyway, I think that's an important way to think about sort of macro statistics. Years ago, I was part of a startup that was designed to compete with the Case-Shiller index. And I remember I was saying, I would constantly say this, and it was very controversial at the time, but it's a reality. There is no national housing market. There are national numbers, and they're a collection of thousands of local markets. But every month, when you see sort of national numbers from the NAR's existing home sales or pending home sales, or Case-Shiller, or you name it, there's tons of these monthly reports that come out every month, and everybody reads them, and they really they have nothing to do with your local housing market. I bring this up because it's sort of, housing is local and mortgage rates are national. I mean, not technically national, but that's why we have Fannie and Freddie, the FHFA, the government sponsored enterprises. The mortgage rates are sort of a national phenomenon that mortgage rates aren't dramatically different in California than in New York or Florida. They're really, they're not national numbers, but there's not much of a variance between those locations. And that's been the way it's been for, almost 100 years. But housing is local. So I encourage you, anytime you're interested in your local housing market, that you pay attention to the local numbers. And I don't know if ignore is the right word, but pay dramatically less attention. You have to be aware of them. If you're a real estate agent and your sellers or buyers are reading the national numbers, then you want to understand that. But you want to understand more that why that doesn't relate to your local housing market. These are just, public relations opportunities for companies that track this data. Anyway, I've probably gone up enough. Let me just summarize some points here. Excuse me. That tariffs, we still have a little pain ahead, but the administration looks like it's trying to walk back or, get out of the corner that they've painted themselves in, where, tariffs are wild, are clearly inflationary, and we're in a world that is slowing down because of higher interest rates. So, and housing has been hit a lot harder than any other segment of the market or the economy, in my mind. So this is very encouraging. However, it's only a 90-day extension. It's not cancellation, and tomorrow they could be brought back in place on a dime. Like, there's still a lot of randomness and lack of strategy to the tariffs that we read about every day. It's sort of bizarre. It continues to be bizarre in my mind. But there seems to be the potential for, less damage to occur to the economy, less possibility of a recession, which I think is good for consumers and good for um, uh, real estate professionals. The other thing is that the scandal in my industry, the appraisal industry, the industry's largest trade group, um, there's a huge piece in Housing Notes last Thursday that I wrote about this. I encourage you to read about it just to be current. I'm going to write something else about it after I finish this podcast for today, to come out at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Just remember that the odds are increasing, that human beings will be less involved in the valuation of real estate. And what that means is that human beings will not, the probability of them seeing the inside of your listing is being reduced, um, uh, and replaced. An individual being replaced by estimates, or the equivalent. Estimate is the consumer brand. And we, as I said earlier, we know how wildly inaccurate they are. They can be really accurate. They can really be really inaccurate, but it's it when they're accurate, it's more of a coincidence than it is actually based on incredible technology or anything like that. And then the third thing is that I think that the last point is that the tariff situation um, is the problem with the tariff situation is that um, I think it's taken, for many markets, it's taken a lot of wind out of the sails of the spring market. That doesn't mean that we won't see um, the we won't see, in some markets, a normal spring market like in New York Metro. Um, yeah, I think we will, because we're already, we've been seeing heavy contract activity for the last 9 months. But we're sort of one of the national exceptions. I think most spring markets will be underwhelming. They certainly will, experience a seasonal uptick, but will be underwhelming from all the uncertainty and the fact that interest rates are sort of stuck at higher levels. I hope that's helpful to you. I encourage you to go to housingnotes.com and sign up for a free subscription. We have a lot. I have a lot of information in there on more on what I've talked about today, but just in general as a resource, you might find it helpful. In other words, thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me today. I hope this was helpful. And one thing I hope you'll come to appreciate over time is to remember always that pie is better than cake.